Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this month's webinar, Safety Planning for Immigrant Standpoint, and Rachel Kohler, our Standpoint staff attorney. Standpoint is a statewide organization. We are a team of attorneys and advocates working to assist individuals who have experienced domestic violence, sexual violence, and trafficking when it includes domestic violence or sexual violence. And we also provide technical assistance to professionals who provide services to survivors as well. Our action line is answered Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. It is through our action line that our attorneys provide legal advice to survivors and our advocates connect callers with resources, safety plan, listen, and also help callers identify possible options and next steps. Some examples of trainings that we do are the annual new law trainings that we do throughout the state of Minnesota, which is coming up in a couple of weeks here. Our first one will be in Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. So if you haven't registered for that, please go into our webpage, standpointmn.org, and register. We also do monthly webinars like this one for advocates, and we do lots of trainings by request. So basically, we're here to help you, so please reach out to us anytime. Today's webinar is being recorded, and I will be uploading it to a YouTube page, Standpoint MN, when it's ready, probably next week. And the link to the recording will also be emailed out to our legal advocates listserv after this webinar when it's ready. So right now, though, I have already uploaded under the chat tab a link to the Dropbox, and that has all the materials that you need for today's webinar, such as the PowerPoint and the handouts that we have put together for you to use as a resource. I also want to draw attention to the question and answer tab. Under that tab, if you have any questions during this webinar, please type that in, and me and Rachel will try to answer them as they come in. So do you have anything, Rachel, or that I missed?
I think it's the chat. The Q&A tab is for if we did a poll. Otherwise, I think it's the chat. I don't know what your screens look like, but I think you can type into the chat if you have questions, and we'll both see it.
Yeah. Also the Q&A too, because that'll show what questions I still need to answer and whatnot. So both is fine. If you want to use the chat, that's fine. The Q&A, but there's a poll one too, Rachel. Whatever.
All right.
Okay.
Sorry, everybody. Learning about Zoom.
Yep. Okay. So in today's webinar, what we're going to be exploring is speaking with clients about immigration status, know your rights information about the police, ICE encounters. We'll talk about preparedness plans, and also resources for friends and family. I will start off with asking about immigration status. So when working with survivors of domestic violence who are immigrants, it's expected that survivors have a lot of fear and caution around sharing their immigration status. And while I was doing direct advocacy work, it was always a best practice for me to build trust with the survivors before I started asking personal questions. And of course, number one, before you can ask any personal questions, you need to know if they need an interpreter, because it would be very difficult to build trust if they didn't understand what you were saying and they couldn't communicate with you. So most likely your organization should already have a language access plan in place and have identified safe interpreters that you can use when you are working with survivors. But if you do not, and you would like help with that, please reach out to me and we can talk more about what is a language access plan and what does that all involve. So just like anyone else that is going through a difficult experience, while not understanding the process, there's lots of questions going through your mind. And how you can help to ease some of that tension is initially in the first meeting, explain your services, talk about your organization, talk about how you can help, and also, very, very important, identify and talk about client confidentiality. I'm explaining what is an advocate's role. And while you're explaining this, do all of this very intentionally. Being intentional means being clear, being detailed, not speaking too fast, and observing the facial expressions and body language of your client, of the survivor, while you're talking to them. So sometimes I'll look to see, if there's signs of any confusion, like shifting of the body, restlessness, they're not able to focus on what you're saying, or they're looking at the interpreter kind of acting like they want to speak up.
Mhm.
So I look for some of those things because those can be indicators that I may need to stop and ask if there's any questions. And after that, making sure to inform them that your organization is not obligated to any other agency, and that you don't share any information that they share with you with anyone else without them signing a release of information. So that can really help help build that trust with them. For more information around confidentiality, we do have a webinar on our YouTube page that you can access after this webinar to get more information around that. But usually advocates, you know, because of our funding with OJP and because of all of that, we have confidentiality things that we need to abide by.
Mhm.
So going through all of this information right away is critical in building that trust. So just imagine how skeptical someone can be when you're trying to talk to them and then you're trying to ask about personal information, especially around sensitive topics like immigration status. If they don't have that trust in you, like they're not going to be ready to share that, right?
Right.
And so after you've talked around the basics of the organization, kind of talked around confidentiality, and you built that confidence up with them a little bit, then you can start to get more information on how you can help, and asking about immigration status and explaining that you'll be asking some questions and that some will be really personal questions, and they might not be comfortable in answering them, but at the same time, reassuring them that you're only asking that for the purposes of identifying the safest option and resources for them, and also letting them know that it's crucial for them to be honest with you, because some of the options you offer will change due to the information they share. You know, you never want to give options that could further danger or further give them more risk because of their immigration status.
Right. And I think,
Mhm.
you know, as we're talking today about safety planning for immigrant survivors, a lot of what we're talking about today is about, you know, rights and responsibilities and ways that they need to or can respond to police officers or ICE officials if they're encountering them. But I do think, you know, when you're doing safety planning, those things only become important when immigration status is at issue. You know, encountering ICE and worrying about going to a courthouse and being picked up by ICE at the courthouse. And so a part and parcel of doing a safety plan with an immigrant survivor is understanding their fears around immigration and in understanding the specifics of their immigration status. So 9 times out of 10, immigration status may not necessarily matter with the work that you're doing with the survivors that you're working with. But when we're talking about safety planning, it is really important to talk about it. And so that's why I think all the information that Ty was giving around how to build that trust and ensure confidentiality is being used, and making your role very clear to them before you ask them those questions is really important.
Yeah, and it really is important, especially in a community where there is a lot of diversity. I actually have a situation where I can share with you things that I've learned along the way of providing advocacy and working with survivors of domestic violence, and also just being in a community that is very diverse. So I lived in Wheeling, Minnesota, which is southwest Minnesota. Um, Probably the raid probably happened in around like 2006, but there was an immigration raid that took place in our community. And during that time, it was a time of a lot of uncertainty, and it was a lot of uncertainty and fear for the entire community. So immigrants were fearful, and their fear was justified because of the raid that had just happened, and also the events that followed and the events that had led up to the raid. So there was lots of things, you know, things they heard on the news, and things that was actually really happening. So it was justified for them to have that fear. I also want to mention that it wasn't just undocumented immigrants that were fearful. It was really all immigrants. No one felt safe. Even if you had a green card, or even if you had status to be in the United States, you know, everybody was just uncertain about what their rights were and what could happen if they did encounter ICE or encounter police asking around their status. And so I want to take this opportunity to share some of the things that I learned and what I gathered from that experience. So um, the community that I lived in at the time that this raid happened, we hadn't really come up with a community plan prior to the raid. And so everything that happened afterwards was just things that um, we did out of reaction. So there wasn't really a plan in place. We didn't have, you know, some go-to things that we had discussed and decided that that was something that we were going to do. Everybody just kind of reacted to situations that they were encountering, and that caused a lot of stress. And so um, afterwards, though, I want to say that the community did a really good job of rallying together after the raid to like help everyone that was involved. A lot of the churches opened up their doors for people who were afraid to go back home, and children also stayed at the churches when they didn't have places to go because their parents might have been taken into custody, um, or their parents didn't feel safe to come back home. And so children stayed in churches, and they also stayed in relatives' homes and things like that as well. But when children would come home from school the day of the raid, they wouldn't know they didn't know what to expect because the house might have been empty because the parents never came back from work, or there was nobody home to unlock the door for them, so kids were not able to get into their home.
Mm.
The schools were scrambling to help students locate the parents, find temporary places for the students to stay. I mean, identifying things like personal need items and just things like that. Like the schools and also the social services programs did a really good job of coming together. But because we didn't have a community plan in place, all of this happened after the fact. Like all of this happened after people were calling each other and being like, this is what I have going on right now. Like, what do we do? And then we were able to gather things. But again, it all it's all a learning experience, right? Um, Also, there was a lot of fear and uncertainty that children and family members were feeling because they didn't know if someone they loved was the people that were detained or if they were hiding out due to the fear of getting detained. And I think this webinar would be helpful because I know later on during the webinar, Rachel's going to share some information on how you can find out that information. So um, even for weeks after that raid, people are afraid to venture out into the community. Like I remember going to work and going shopping in the stores, and it was just like dead. Like it was like a dead city. There were people just weren't out and about, and everybody's doors were shut, and people were just scared. So, that raid really affected the community for lots of weeks, even years afterwards. Um, a lot of that had to do with there's lots of rumors circling around about ICE agents still in the community. Police were working with ICE agents and that they were just going randomly on people's doors and knocking and arresting people. So there was lots of rumors, lots of stories that were circulating. And because people are already afraid, it's easy to really get sucked in and to believe some of that. But although some things were true and some things were not, one thing we do know is that people really were afraid. Like they were uncertain and they didn't know what was safe to do and what was not safe to do. Um, so the main takeaway that the community I lived in learned from this was we needed to have a community plan. And this community plan should involve people who were from that community. So it was concerned individuals, professionals from like all sectors, from schools, community education, leaders in the community, social service organizations, business owners, employers from the community. But in order for a community plan to be successful, it needed to have participation from the entire community, like representatives from the entire community. And it's also really important to have people from all the ethnic groups in your community to be a part of these discussions because, you know, not having all of the ethnic communities be involved would also mean that you're not going to get the real what are options that people really see would work. And if you, again, going back to building trust, if you don't have the leaders within those ethnic communities going out into the community and talking and helping being the voice, this plan might not go anywhere. Okay,
Mm.
so having the expertise and involvement from all people from the community, representing the community, is crucial for the success of this plan. And I was an advocate working for a DVSB organization at that time. And I remember we were contacted by lots of family members and friends of people who were detained or who didn't come home. And they were wondering, um, do you know what happened, or how can we find out what happened to this to our family member? And
Mm.
so we ended up being a safe place for people to come and to ask questions, and connecting them with resources, listening, validating their fear, talking around options and things like that. Like, our organization kind of became like a hub for that, just because we had built that reputation in the community where, you know um, immigrants and people who were in crisis situations felt like it was safe to come and talk to us. So,
Mhm.
mhm.
So, I mean, this happened in the Worthington raids happened in what, 2006, 2007, Ty?
Yeah, it was 2006, and I think we actually had another one in like 2008.
Yeah, I mean, so raids and these types of ICE raids are not new, but obviously, which I'm going to talk about on this slide, we are seeing some more current trends towards fear around ICE invading communities, fear around raids at places of work and people's personal homes. This is understandable given that, our president, and I even, included the tweet up there on June 17th of this year, stated the next week ICE will begin the process of removing millions of illegal aliens who found their way illegally into the United States. So when you make a comment like that, it's obvious that that fear that Ty was talking about, which was so prevalent in her community back in the mid 2000s, people are starting to feel that fear again. And there are definitely some people who have experienced immigration raids in the past and who are now fearing that that is going to happen again. I just put like a little mini timeline just based on what was happening more recently, that the president announced that there were going to be these raids on June 17th. Then that weekend, they announced that the raids are specifically going to focus in, and I want to say it was like 6 or 7 major cities, and it was going to mostly hone in on people who had prior deportation orders, or people who, I mean, I think specifically they were looking at folks who had come into the country recently. They had immigration court. They either showed up at immigration court and were ordered deported, or they didn't show up to court at all. And so in their absence, they got a deportation order against them. And so specifically those people who, absconded from the criminal justice system, they were going to focus in on those people in these raids and try and attempt to deport those people. And then obviously, as we, there's a lot of confusion. Was it going to happen that weekend? It was delayed. The president announced that it was going to be delayed to allow Congress an opportunity to fix the problem at the border. And then starting the weekend of July 12th, that was a Friday, there was a small number of targeted ICE raids in those 6 to 7 metropolitan areas, but it was a lot less than I think a lot of people were expecting. Instead of having massive raids, they were a bunch of kind of smaller clusters of raids in certain communities. We're definitely seeing raids still continue to happen in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities area, but instead of being these big raids that make big news, we're seeing, smaller, more minor ICE enforcement actions kind of happening in clusters rather than having any massive immigration raids. And so this presentation is really a response to a lot of the questions I was getting, both from immigrants in the community, but also from advocates who are working with immigrant survivors, just wanting to know, how can we be a resource? How can we ensure that our clientele is doing what they need to do to be safe? And so, as I had kind of said earlier, one of the main things that we can be doing as advocates, one of the big tools that we can be using, is just ensuring the clients that we're working with what their legal rights are. if they were to encounter police or they were to encounter ICE and be asked about their immigration status. So I'm going to go through a couple of different scenarios as to what they can do, legal rights in the public, in the home, and in your car. But I do want to, before I sort of jump into the legal rights portion of the presentation, I do want to note that every encounter with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, every encounter with police is going to be very unique. It's going to be fact specific. And so today I'm really focusing more on basic rights in a standard encounter. Because, you know, the authority of ICE officers or the authority of police officers can really change depending on the facts. So if you think about it, if police are in an active pursuit, or if they develop probable cause that a crime has occurred based on evidence that they're seeing around the person, or maybe they believe someone is in imminent danger inside of a home, like that really changes their authority and it really changes what they can do. And so I'm not focusing on all of the different scenarios. That would be a much longer presentation, but I am going to focus on sort of a basic encounter, legal rights, and some possible strategies that clients can take. So the first slide is about rights of all people in the United States. And really the crux of this slide is just to remind folks that you don't have to have documented immigration status in order to have protections under the US Constitution. Anybody who's on United States soil has rights under the US Constitution. So that includes the Fourth Amendment, which is the right against unreasonable searches and seizures. So the Fourth Amendment is what protects you from having people be able to search your body or come into your car or come into your home and search whenever they want. Typically, in order to do that, there needs to be probable cause or there needs to be a warrant signed. So that's a right of everybody in the United States, including people who don't have documented status. Also, everybody's entitled to our Fifth Amendment rights, the right to remain silent and the right to due process. When I say due process, that means I can exercise my legal rights and have a court process before being charged with something criminally or before being deported. This changes a little bit, this due process right, and again, a lot of this stuff could be a full presentation. But if you already have a deportation order or you're caught within a certain distance from the border, they may be able to remove you without necessarily having you appear in front of a judge. It's a very particular situation, but if you're working with a survivor who has a prior deportation order, that's a little bit more serious, and some of those due process rights might be different. So just something to keep in mind. But in general, everybody still has that right to go in front of a judge and actually have a hearing prior to being deported. Everybody also has rights under the Sixth Amendment. That's a right to a lawyer, but important to note that this is in the criminal context only. So I'm going to kind of reiterate some of these things later in the presentation, but if you are picked up by a local police officer, you do have the right, if you cannot afford a lawyer, to get a lawyer appointed to you, also called the public defender. Unfortunately, those kinds of attorneys, that kind of right, doesn't exist in the context of an immigration court. So if you're going to immigration court, you have the right to hire a lawyer. You certainly have a right to have an attorney there, but you do not have the right to have a free lawyer. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then there at the bottom, just to remind everybody that anybody, regardless of their status, always has the right to access police protection. So, you know, just because you don't have documented status doesn't mean that you shouldn't call the police if you are in danger or in need of that protection. Similarly, you can access the court system. If you need to file for divorce, you need to file for custody, you need to file for a protective order. Regardless of immigration status, you have the right to access that court system. And then everybody has a right to a free public education. So if you're working with immigrant children who may not have status, they still have the right to that free public education within the public school system. Okay. So now I'm going to jump into a little bit about ICE authority. And when I say ICE, I'm meaning Immigration and Customs Enforcement. This is the law enforcement branch of immigration. And the reason why I want to spend a couple of slides just talking about ICE authority is because I think it can be confusing for people to know if an ICE officer walks up to me, can they ask me questions about my immigration status? Is that okay? Can they search me? Can they come into my home? So I think it's important that we understand, and some of these powers and authorities are very similar to what you would see in the law enforcement context, but some of them are a little bit different. So if you look here, this is ICE authority without a warrant. So they don't even need to have a warrant in order to be able to do the following things. First, the right to interrogate regarding immigration status. This is obviously different than from a typical police officer who's enforcing criminal laws. Because ICE is specifically a law enforcement agency which is tasked with investigating and enforcing immigration violations, that right to interrogate regarding immigration status is a lot broader. Whereas police officers don't necessarily, well, they're definitely not enforcing or policing immigration violations. So police officers really shouldn't be asking about immigration status. But ICE officers, it's very different. And so something to be aware of, something that they do have the right to do without a warrant. They also have the right to arrest in certain circumstances. So this includes if they're caught, if an ICE official watches somebody illegally enter the United States, they have the right to arrest that person without a warrant. Similarly, if they believe a person has committed a felony, and maybe that person is likely to escape before they have time to get a warrant, they would have the right to arrest that person. And also if a crime, and this is again similar to what you would see in a typical police officer context, but if a crime is committed in front of an officer, an ICE officer can certainly arrest in that circumstance as well without getting a warrant. They also have the right to board and search vehicles as long as that vehicle is within 25 miles of the border. I include this on here because we obviously in the state of Minnesota are a border state. So it's something to keep in mind even when we're talking about the Canadian border. And also, they can search a person who is seeking admission into the United States. So if they're crossing the border, regardless of whether or not they have any reason to believe that person has anything on them or any reason to search them, if they're crossing the border trying to get into the United States, ICE officials have the right to pat down that person and to see what they're carrying in order to potentially deny their admission. I see a question in the chat box, Ty. I probably should be letting you handle this, but I see that someone has asked, do ICE officers wear appropriate identifying apparel? Not always. They should have and I don't have a picture of it on any of these slides, but they should have ICE police or some kind of ICE insignia like you're seeing there on their clothing when they're uniformed. But I'll talk about this a little later in the presentation, oftentimes ICE officers will purely identify themselves as police and not necessarily as ICE police or an ICE officer. So if you're not sure who you're talking to or who you're encountering, I would absolutely ask the question, like, can I have your identification? What agency do you work with? I think that's important because it may not always be clear if you're actually communicating with an ICE officer. So a very good question. Okay, so I talked about the ICE authority without a warrant, but there are also things called ICE warrants. So an ICE warrant is for ICE officers to arrest and detain individuals for civil immigration violation. So an ICE warrant is not in any way connected to criminal infractions or criminal violations, solely for civil immigration violations. Also important to note that the ICE warrant, which I talk about in the last bullet point there, does not compel action from local law enforcement. So local law enforcement is going to be enforcing criminal violations, not immigration violations. Local law enforcement does not have the authority to investigate or enforce immigration violations. So anytime that you see police officers involved in raids, usually that is in collaboration with immigration and customs enforcement. It's also really important to note that warrants are not all created equal. So ICE warrants are very different than criminal warrants. And in the next slide, I'm actually going to show you a side-by-side example. So an ICE warrant does not give authority to an ICE officer to enter a private space in order to search or arrest a person they believe has violated immigration law. So if an ICE officer is trying to enter a private space, that could be a home or it could be a shelter, they cannot do so with an ICE warrant unless they've been given permission to enter. So we'll talk about some different ways to respond when ICE is at your front door trying to get in with an ICE warrant. But just to know that criminal warrants are reviewed and signed by judges, and so it's been vetted. All of those, Fourth Amendment violations or Fourth Amendment rights have already been reviewed, and it's been determined that, yes, there's enough here that we're going to allow officers to enter your home and search. So a judge actually already vets that and signs the warrant. That does not exist in an ICE warrant. ICE warrants are purely administrative and signed only by other ICE officials. So something to be very cautious of. So
there's a comment, Rachel,
yep,
question actually, and I actually had questions around this from other people too.
yep,
In recent news, ICE officers broke a car window to get a man out.
yep,
Is this legal, and how do we curb the fears of this happening? And so there has been lots of news
yeah,
in online and in newspapers around ICE agents, ICE officers, and them. There was that article yesterday that was shared, and so can you clarify some things around that? I mean, it was
I
kind of a little bit about what you were just talking about, but
yep,
I think it was really good to know that there's two different types of like a warrant, right? Is that what you call it? That
yep,
ICE officers can have, and one is a judicial one, or I don't know. There's like two different ones, where
yep.
one.
I'm going to talk
Uh,
about that. But yeah, I
okay.
see the question, and so we've seen the news too, and in the immigration community, there's a lot of discussions around actually that particular incident, which I think happened in South Minneapolis, where a window was broken and somebody was pulled out and arrested. I mean, certainly if ICE has an arrest warrant, they can pull somebody over and execute that arrest warrant. Whether or not I think that there is a lot of discussions around the fact that breaking the window and pulling somebody out of the car was excessive. And so I don't know enough information about what exactly happened in that particular incident. And from the information I was gathering from other immigration attorneys, they also were not exactly sure about the facts of what happened. But I have a lot of questions and concerns around ICE officers going to the extent of actually breaking a car window to get a person out. So I don't know the answer to that question. I do know that it's a really, really good question, and one that I have myself. I know ICE officers are able to stop and arrest, obviously is within their authority, but whether or not the manner in which they did that was excessive force, I guess that would be an argument that I would make. But I am not 100% sure what the facts of that particular scenario were. So I think that seems excessive. I would not anticipate that that's the way most immigration and customs enforcement is done. But I don't know that I have a great answer for how to curb fears from this happening again. I think we just need to be really vigilant, and we need to be investigating these cases and making sure that excessive force isn't happening. And if it is, that people are being held accountable for that. So I do know folks are looking into that particular matter. I don't have any more information to give you on that right now. If you look on your screen right now, like you were talking about, Ty, the two different kinds of warrants. So the warrant that you see on the left side is a judicial signed warrant. It's a search warrant. It specifically identifies what they're looking for, where they're looking for it. But the really important part is that you see here at the bottom, it is signed by a judge of district court. So that means they've actually reviewed the request for the warrant. They determined that there's enough here to allow officers to go into a home and to search for these specific things. However, if you look at the warrant on the right side, so this is warrant for arrest of an alien. It is an ICE or a Homeland Security document. It's actually Form I-200. I cut off the bottom, or you would see that that's the form title. But instead of being signed by a judge of district court, as you see on the left side, and I'm sorry, I know this is really small. Maybe if you pull up the PDF on your screens, you can see it a little better. But what it says here is signature of authorized immigration officer. Authorized immigration officers are not judges. They don't have the legal authority to really vet it to the same extent that a judge does. And so in that way, this warrant for arrest of an alien on the right side, is not sufficient to allow somebody to go into a space without being given permission to move into that space. So it's really important to sort of look at these two things to know when you're being given a warrant to search what the difference is between a judicially signed warrant and then a warrant signed by an immigration officer. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so now I'm going to move into the particular spaces where you may encounter ICE or police officials, and then how we should be advising the survivors that we're working with to respond. Obviously, as I said before, I'm talking about kind of a standard encounter. Every encounter is different, but generally, if you are approached by ICE or police in a public space, it's important to stay calm. And I don't mean that to be patronizing in any way. It's important for me to, I mean, if I were approached by an officer, I think it would be very difficult to remain calm, to not get agitated, and very specifically to not run. If you get agitated, especially if you do run out of fear or, you know, believing that you've done something wrong, then you could potentially also be charged with evading a police officer or with another crime. And so it's important to remain calm and collected during the encounter with ICE or police officers. Also very important, and again, seems obvious, but do not lie or give officers fake documents. The reason why I really want to talk about that particular bullet point is that many of the folks I work with who don't have documented status may be using false names or false documents in order to allow them to work or to drive. My recommendation is to never provide false names to police officers, even if you've been using that false name sort of in your public life and your work life. Provide them either with no name or provide them with your real name. If you give them a false name, that could also be a crime which you are separately charged for. Similarly, if you have fake documents used to work or used to drive, do not carry those fake documents on your person. Leave those documents at home. If for some reason police or ICE officials are able to search your person and they find fake documents on you, again, that's something else that you could be charged criminally for, even though you hadn't done anything else wrong. And then always remember your legal rights. So again, it's that reminder of your Fifth Amendment right to stay silent. If you decide that you want to invoke that right to remain silent, you should state your intention to do so out loud. So you should actually say, like, I'm invoking, or I'd like to use my right to remain silent. In some states, there are statutes around how law enforcement, if they stop and ask for your name, you're legally obligated to provide them with your name. Minnesota does not have a stop and identify statute. It doesn't exist in our law. And so if you are stopped by an ICE officer or police officer and they're asking for your name, use your judgment. Obviously, refusing to provide your name may cause them to be more interested in you, dig a little deeper. But if you don't feel safe or comfortable providing them with that information, you can always invoke your right to remain silent, regardless of your immigration status. Also, that Fourth Amendment right against unreasonable search and seizure, you do not have to consent to the search of yourself. Police officers may ask you if they can search your body, and you can say no. You do not have to consent to that. If a police officer believes that somebody is carrying a weapon, that would be a circumstance in which they have the authority to pat you down. But you do not have to affirmatively consent to that search of yourself. And in fact, if you do consent to that, it gives them total authority to be able to do that without any issue. Also, if you are being arrested or detained, you have the right to know that, and you have the right to know why. So oftentimes when we're, coaching people on how to handle an ICE or a police encounter, we coach people to ask, am I free to leave? Am I being detained or arrested right now? And if the answer is no, then you are free to walk away. You don't have to remain in that dialogue with them. Okay, so what happens if police encounter you at home? Again, another common theme, stay calm. My recommendation would be to keep the door closed until you know who's there. So like the question that we heard earlier around, are you always going to know if the officer is an ICE officer? Are they identifying themselves? You may not know. ICE will frequently knock on the door and say, police, open up. And they won't necessarily identify themselves as Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So very important prior to opening your door to ask for identification, to ask, are you ICE officers? Are you police officers? And then to ask for that warrant. Without a warrant, you don't have to open your door. You don't have to allow them entrance into your home. If they have a warrant, ask them either to slide it under the door, or they can hold it up to the window if you have a window on your door in order for you to see what the actual document says. Again, if it is a document signed by a judge, that may allow that officer to enter your home to the limited extent that is included in that warrant. But if it is an ICE warrant, again, to go back to that slide and to see exactly what that looks like, if it is signed by an authorized immigration official, that does not allow them to enter the home. And you can very, capably say, this warrant doesn't allow you to access my home. I don't give you consent to come in here. And always remember your legal rights. So as always, you have the right to remain silent. You don't have to respond if somebody is home. They might say, is so-and-so there? You don't have to answer that question. You do have the right to remain silent. And you don't have to let them in. They may ask you to consent to the search of your home. And if you consent to that, then again, you really are allowing them access to that space. But you don't have to do that unless they have a warrant that is signed by a judge. And Ty, please stop me if we're getting any questions. I'm kind of just cooking along now.
Yep, there's no question, so go ahead.
Okay, great. If anything I'm saying isn't making sense or you have additional questions, please feel free to put it in the chat box. So what happens if ICE or police encounter you in your car? This slide is a little bit longer, first because I think people are concerned about this, but also I believe there's a little bit of a difference between police officers and ICE officers in this regard. So if you are being pulled over, pull over in a safe place, turn on that internal light, open your window part way, and place your hands on the wheel. And this is just a general safety technique in order to allow officers to see inside your car, to see that you're safe, to see that you're not reaching for anything by putting the hands on the wheel. When we're talking about police officers in, let's say, a standard traffic stop, that police officer is going to have the right to ask the driver for their license, registration, and proof of insurance. Obviously, not having some of that information is a traffic violation, and so the driver does have to respond to the police officer to the extent that they're giving their information around their authorization to drive. It does not extend to passengers. So if a police officer has pulled you over and they're asking questions about passengers, unless they have probable cause or reason to be asking those questions, the passengers don't have to answer. However, as I put there, the authority will always extend if there's probable cause of a crime. So if you're being pulled over for speeding, police officer walks up to the window and sees that there's a weapon in your car, or sees a drug paraphernalia in the center console, or smells alcohol on the person's breath. This could cause their authority to extend further. But in general, absent those things, they really shouldn't be asking any questions of passengers, and they really shouldn't be searching your car any further than they need to for a regular traffic stop. If you are pulled over by an ICE officer, and it is not uncommon for ICE officers to pull folks over in their car, that is something that they can do if they have a reasonable suspicion that somebody in the car is inadmissible or deportable. And they can ask for immigration papers of both the driver and passengers. What I would say is, if that happens, always remember your rights. So again, if that happens, if they are asking for those immigration papers, drivers and passengers have the right to remain silent. I would recommend that if you are over the age of 18 and you have immigration documents, let's say you have a U visa or you have a visitor visa or you have a green card, so you have immigration documents, to carry those documents with you at all times if you are over the age of 18. And if you have those documents on your person and they're asking questions, that you should respond by giving them the documents that you have. However, if you don't have those documents on you, or you're not documented, you don't have legal documents, then I would recommend that they invoke their right to remain silent. As a passenger, you are always free to ask if you are being detained or arrested. If you are not, you are free to leave the scene. And similar to a search of your person or a search of your home, you can absolutely refuse to consent to a search of your car. The only reason they would be able to search your car without your consent is if they believe there's evidence of a crime inside your vehicle, but they need to have that sort of additional knowledge of that evidence of a crime in order to be able to do that without your consent. Any questions from that time? Also to give me time to drink.
It says here, what type of vehicle do ICE agents drive? Do they look like regular police vehicles? Police say you should never pull over for a person out of uniform.
Yeah, and that's very true. If an ICE officer is pulling you over, they should have a uniform on. I don't know what their vehicles look like. That's actually a really good question that I don't know the answer to. I don't know if they're in unmarked cars. But the folks I have talked to who have been pulled over by Immigration and Customs Enforcement have said that they have like the lights and the cherries on top of the car. So I do know that they have some method in which to pull over, and I completely agree. If they're non-uniformed, then I wouldn't pull over my car, or I wouldn't roll down my window. They should be uniformed if they're pulling you over in a car.
Okay, and there's a couple of other questions too.
Yeah.
So can you clarify on the right to remain silent during a traffic stop? So it sounds like you are able to not provide documents with that. Is that correct? Like immigration documents, not the license registration.
Right. So my recommendation in that regard would be, again, if you do have documents and you're over the age of 18, that you should be carrying them with you and you should be supplying them. That can put an end to a very, what could be a much worse encounter if you have those things on you. If you don't have those things on you, or you are not documented, then you would invoke your right. Then my recommendation would be to invoke your right to remain silent at that point in time. And so I'm specifically talking around ICE officers asking for your immigration papers. I'm not necessarily talking about police officers asking for, driver's licenses or registration, things like that. Does that make sense?
They haven't responded yet, so yes, but it does sound like it makes sense. For
Okay.
those asking around the PowerPoint, if you go all the way up to the beginning of the chat box that you see on the chat, the link on the bottom there, I have uploaded the link to our Dropbox, which has the PowerPoint in it. So, and you can access that at any time during this. If you want to access this later, please shoot an email out to me and I can send that to you via email. But with Zoom, we have the capability to upload it into the chat box, and then after this closes, you won't be able to get it again. So if you want that now, please, everybody just please upload it and then save it onto your computer, okay?
Mm-hmm. And if you aren't able to do that right now, like Ty said, just send her an email and we can send those documents to you later. And to remind everybody that this is a recorded training, and so if you want to go back in and take some notes later, if you're not able to do so right now, you can view it on YouTube later. Okay, so the next slide I'm going to talk about is what happens if you're already arrested. You're already being detained by ICE or police officers. Many of your rights are the same in both scenarios, but I kind of wanted to point out a couple of distinctions. So in both circumstances, you always have that right to remain silent. My recommendation would be not to sign anything without speaking to an attorney first. And that's really important in both contexts, but like especially if you are an immigrant client and you are have been arrested by police officers, criminal convictions or even beyond convictions, just pleas in a criminal context can have very serious effects on your immigration status. It is part of law now that your defense attorney needs to discuss immigration consequences with you in your criminal case. So it's really, really important that folks don't sign anything without speaking to a lawyer first and talking about what those potential immigration consequences could be. When we're talking about police arrest, you also have the right to a phone call. Important to note that if you call an attorney, calls cannot be recorded in that circumstance. If you call somebody beyond an attorney, however, that those phone calls are recorded. Also, as I said before, in the criminal context, if you cannot afford an attorney, you have the right to a free attorney, a public defender. When we're talking about an ICE arrest, it remains the same to remain silent. Don't sign anything without speaking to an immigration attorney first. You do have the right to an interpreter. As Ty was saying before around working within advocacy, it's really important that folks understand what's going on. We're not joking around when we're talking about being arrested and detained. So if the person needs an interpreter, to be asking for that interpreter. It's also really important to have information about your the nearest consulate to you so that you could contact your consulate. There's a bunch of different resources that consulates have around being detained. So it could be very important to contact your consulate if you've been arrested or detained. And in the immigration context, you do have the right to hire an attorney, but you do not have the right to a free attorney. Again, this is going to be the time where I remind people, if you are working with someone who has a prior deportation order, that person may be deported without the chance to appear in front of a judge. And that's because they already have on their record a deportation order. So it's not like they're, instead of actually going through the criminal process again, what they are arguing is that you already have a deportation order. You've already been through the criminal process or the court process, and you've already been ordered deported. Therefore, we're just executing that order. So in those cases, if you're working with those clients, first, it's important to speak to an attorney right away. But second, if you have fear or concerns around returning to your country of origin, if you believe that you are going to be harmed, potentially killed if you go back to your home country, it is so important that they inform the ICE officer of that fear. If they inform them of that, there's something called a credible fear or a reasonable fear screening that they have to go through prior to deportation. So that could delay the deportation so that they don't get removed right away without appearing in front of a judge. So just important things to keep in mind. Okay, now I'm kind of...
Before we go to the next topic here, I do have one question, Rachel.
Absolutely.
Someone asked, well, there's two questions now, but will the ICE agent give documents back? And if for some reason they do not give back documents, what actions should they take?
So they do need to return documents that are lawful. If you're having problems getting documents returned to you, then I would speak to an immigration attorney and they can speak with the ICE agents around getting those documents returned. However, if it is a fake document, if it is an unlawful document, they do not have to return that document to you. So if it's an expired document, a fake document, then they're taking it into their custody. They're not returning that. But if it is a lawful document, then they should be returning that. And so I would connect with an immigration attorney to make sure that that's getting done.
Okay, and then another question: can an immigrant arrested or detained if involved? Can an immigrant arrested or detained if get involved into a car accident if they are the cause of the accident?
So if they're driving the car, there's an accident, could they be arrested or detained? I mean, I think it really depends on the circumstances. If we're talking about like a car accident in the middle of a chase with police officers or a car accident where the person has been drinking. I mean, I think where we're talking about where there may be criminal violations, yes, they could absolutely be arrested, just like any of us could be arrested. But in a standard car accident where two people, you know, bump into each other and they pull over and exchange information, maybe police gets called. Again, I would go back to the slide I had around encounters with ICE or police in your car, that you don't have to talk to them about your immigration status. You may end up getting citations if you don't have proper authorization to drive. So if we're talking about folks who are undocumented, usually they don't have driver's licenses or insurance. They may be cited for that. But they shouldn't be picked up for any immigration violations, because police officers, local police officers, should not be looking for immigration violations, and they should not be asking about immigration status. If they do, my advice would be to invoke your right to remain silent and speak with an immigration attorney first.
All right.
Okay. Thank you. So now we're moving on to a different section where Ty is going to be doing a little bit more discussions around preparedness plans.
Okay. Thank you, Rachel, for that. And that was a lot of information, and it's really helpful.
So much.
Yeah, it is very helpful to know that information. And I know, Rachel's office is right next to mine, and it's good for me to keep hearing this from her, to know, because it's just so different. And like, what does this warrant look like, and what does that warrant look like, and is that a valid warrant? And talking to your clients around like not being afraid, and it's okay to not have a response right away, because I know that I get really nervous at all times just because of my personality, but I get nervous a lot around lots of things. And then especially when there's a public, somebody of authority standing right in front of me and asking me questions, I feel a lot of pressure to want to answer right away or want to do everything that is that they tell me to do, because I'm just scared that I forget that I do have rights, So I myself, as a citizen of the United States, I have fear already. And so I just can really relate to, like, and also understand when people tell me that they're afraid and tell me that they are not comfortable in not giving some of these documents to officers and ICE agents when asked for them, even though they know that they have the right not to give them. So it's good to talk about it numerous times with people that you're serving that have this concern. Okay. And again,
yeah, and I mean, before you get into this, Ty, just like the crux of a lot of what I talked about there, because there's a lot of specifics around if you're pulled over in a car, if you're at your home. I mean, the real crux of the matter is everybody has the same constitutional rights, no matter what their status. So that right to remain silent, that right not to consent to a search, all of those things remain true regardless of your immigration status and regardless of the context. And so just really important to remind folks of that, because when you're undocumented, you may not know, are my rights the same as their rights? What do I have to do? What don't I have to do? So continue to remind them that they have all of the same constitutional rights that we all do.
Thank you. Okay. So we're going to, go on to our next slide here, and we're talking about creating preparedness plans. And I think this is just a really good topic for us to go over. And if you have further questions around this, reach out to us as well. But, we all need to have a plan in case we face an emergency or any unexpected situation. And this is even more important for people who are undocumented, or for families that are made up of people with mixed immigration statuses. So some of the reasons why it's important for all families and individuals to have a preparedness plan is that by being prepared, it helps us to make decisions on our own before they're made for us. And it also frees us from being anxious, because we have done what we can to plan for the unexpected. And it also helps us to be ready in case of an emergency, so that we do not have to do things at the last minute. And it protects our children and our families from unnecessary disruption. And it also protects what we have worked hard to earn in the best way possible. So these preparedness plans really are something that helps kind of lessen anxiety, and especially when you're uncertain around, if this were to happen, what's going to happen with my kids? So we're going to talk a lot around like financial and all of that stuff, but just a lot of the reasons why it's really important to talk about this and to add this into safety plans that your organizations already have, right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like preparedness plans just in general are a part of safety planning, regardless of status. But when you're talking about
Mm-hmm.
immigration status, where the fear of being detained and potentially deported is made more real, it makes some of these preparedness plans even more important. And you hope that you'll never have to use them. You hope that you're just being overly cautious. But in the circumstance where you may need to actually use one of these, it's so much better when thought has been put into the preparedness plan and you're ready in case the worst does happen.
Yeah. Um, so preparedness plans when you have children, having a plan about who you would like to take care of the children when you're unable to do so. So this trusted adult should have access to emergency phone numbers and other important contact information. Also, talking with your children around who this person is and having them made aware of the plan. Like, if something were to happen to me and I'm not going to pick you up from school, or if whatever, this is who's going to be doing that. And having this conversation with your child or your children in a way where it doesn't cause panic. So sometimes when we talk about this and there's already been a lot of excitement around the home where there's been conversations and discussions about a lot of uncertainty, it's going to add to that anxiety for children. So part of a preparedness plan is to do all of this before something happens. And so the environment in the home and things is going to be more calm. And so children are like, oh, okay, so this is just something that I need to know, not necessarily that it's going to happen, but in case it did happen, this is just for you to know, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And also, talking about those important contact numbers, writing that down, working with children to memorize the names and the numbers um, is also good. And also, being in contact with your children's school, make sure that if they're going to release the children, to that trusted adult that you have selected, that the school knows about that. Update the names and update who can come and pick up your children in the event that you can't. And if you've obtained a protective order against someone, the school should also be aware of that and have a copy of the order as well. Um, Writing down any medical or dental information regarding your children is important too, and putting that information in a safe place. So, what I have suggested before with some of the clients that I was working with is just having a plastic tub, like like a plastic shoe box or whatever that you can just buy at Walmart, Target, and then storing some of those, immunization records, dental records, medical records, any prescriptions that your child is taking, and things like that. Now, the reason I say a plastic tub or a plastic box that can be sealed a little bit is because just to prevent from any damage, like water damage and things like that. Because most likely when you store these documents, you're going to put it away somewhere, right? You're going to give it to someone and they're going to store it for you, or you're going to store it away somewhere where you feel safe doing so. And in case there's any water damage or anything happens around that, like it doesn't damage the documents that you have. And also having passports. So make sure, all your children have passports in case they need to be reunited with you, and checking the requirements at your consulate or embassy for obtaining a child's passport if you don't have one already.
So I know the Mexican consulate has come to a couple of meetings I've been at, and they've been really upfront about the fact that the consulate is a really good place for like getting citizenship for your children. So maybe your children were born in the United States, but your client is a Mexican citizen. Their children may also derive Mexican citizenship, but they have nothing to prove that. And so if you do get removed or sent back to Mexico, then it may be necessary for your children to obtain the citizenship to Mexico and get their Mexican passport in order to be able to reunite with you. And so oftentimes consulates can be really helpful in gathering that document. However, I do want to make a note that when we're talking about working or getting passports when you are in an abusive relationship, it can often require, it can be difficult because it can often require the consent of both parents in order to get passports. It really depends on the country that you're talking about. I know to get a United States passport, it can be really difficult if both parents are listed on the birth certificate and only one parent is there to apply for the child. So as it relates to applying for passports and you're dealing with abusers, it can be really important both to call us, we can maybe talk you through that, or connect with the consulate and be really open about that person's particular situation and getting their passport, seeing what they can do in order to get the passport issued to the child. But I also want to talk a little bit about the delegation of parental authority, also called a DOPA. Folks may have heard of this. There's been a lot of talk about this in the immigration community. But what a delegation of parental authority is it gives legal authority to a third person, to someone you're designating to take care of your child if, in the event you are detained or deported. It's a real easy one-page document. It's all of the information, and actually a sample of the DOPA is included in the Dropbox. And so when you are deciding whether or not to do a delegation of parental authority, it's really important that you're designating somebody that you trust, who's willing to care for your children, ideally someone who has stable immigration status. It is not something you have to file with the court. So a delegation of parental authority takes effect when both people sign in front of a notary. They're only valid for 1 year. So if you sign one this year and nothing, thankfully nothing has happened in this year, but next year when the delegation of parental authority expires, you want to do another one, you will have to execute another one again in front of a notary at that time. But for folks who are really worried about the care of their children, it may not be a bad idea for us as advocates to encourage them to get these delegation of parental authorities signed, and then to just keep them in their files at home in the event that something may happen. So again, please see the delegation of parental authority handout in the Dropbox. If you have any additional questions about the DOPA, please feel free to let me know.
Okay. As far as the preparedness plan and doing some financial, addressing some of the financial concerns is, keep the important documents again in a safe place that trusted family members know about. So things like birth certificates, passports, and other immigration documents, and also any bank account information, where do you bank, and things like that. So keeping all of that and having copies of your bank statements and things like that. Providing a trusted friend or family member with information on how to pick up your paycheck if you are unable to do so. So, and this is in situations where you're not getting like direct deposit and things, but talking to your employer and letting them know, like, if I can't come pick up my paycheck, I give permission for so-and-so to pick it up. And when I was doing this advocacy for the meatpacking plant back down in southern Minnesota, sometimes employers, depending on the employer, they would want like first name, last name, and then even including like a photo of that person. So just depending upon the employer, they're going to ask for specific details around that. But this is a way where doing this in advance will guarantee that at least you're going to be able to get any money that is going to be coming to you during a time where you probably will be needing more money, like money. Informing trusted family members about, where do you bank, where do you keep your financial assets, and all of those things, like sharing some of that information with at least one person that you really do trust. Another thing is making a list of monthly expenses that you pay and determining if you're not around and able to make those payments, who could make those payments for you. So things that are regularly paid, like your cable bill or your housing, any loans that you have, and things like that. Like, what is it that you pay every month? What is the method of payment for that? And talking to someone around that. I mean, I've helped people, and this is also part of like budgeting and things. And so sometimes as you're working with your clients around creating budgets and monthly budgets and things, like even just making another copy of that, if it's something that's taken out of their checking account directly, or if it's something where, you go online, they go online and do that every month. Like, what is the login for that, and what is the password for that, and having discussions around creating logins and passwords that will be safe as well. So a lot of these things it becomes really technical, and when you talk about language barriers and when someone has language issues, sometimes it's really good to think about this in advance, because we've created things where words that aren't common, but things that relate to them that they can really remember, and that's not complicated and whatnot. So just having that time to prepare some of this in advance can be really helpful.
Yeah, and I mean, so my husband and I actually just bought a house, and we have to pay for garbage, we have to pay for electricity, we have to pay for water. And previously, one of us would be listed on the utilities, like my partner would handle all of the utilities. If something were to happen to him and I had to take over paying for those utilities, I didn't have access to his account information, I wasn't listed on the account. So it would have been really, difficult. I would have had to kind of jump through hoops in order to just make sure that I'm making my monthly payment so my water doesn't get cut off. So it's a similar mindset. If you have these monthly obligations, you need to make sure that if you are detained, that someone is going to be able to make those payments so that your family at back home doesn't lose access to their electricity or their heating. And similarly, if you have investments, if you have paychecks that need to be picked up and you're being detained and you might be able to make bond or you might be able to make bail, it's important that somebody outside of yourself has access to that funding in order to be able to assist you.
And another thing that I think about too, when you're talking about safety planning and you're talking about financially safety planning, we know that a lot of some immigrants, they might not have information around this. Like, I've worked with lots of immigrants who don't know where it is that they bank at, who don't know what monthly expenses are done. And so again, I'm going to emphasize the importance of bringing this up and possibly as their advocate, helping them find out some of this information before it becomes too late for them to get this information, right? And so we're aware, and we know that there's limitations, and that sometimes abusers use, financial control over their partners. But another reason why it's really important that survivors are in contact with advocacy.
And I'll talk briefly about the power of attorney, kind of similar to when I talked about the delegation of parental authority. There's another really good guide, which we've included on the Dropbox, a handout of the power of attorney guide. So what it basically does is it gives permission to another person, to a third party, to take care of your property or money matters for you if you are unable to do so. They have to be over 18 years old, and similar to a delegation of parental authority, I would make sure that you're choosing someone who you trust deeply, because they're going to have access to all of your financial matters. Also make sure that they have information regarding to your financial matters. It's only, this attorney, in fact, this person who has this power of attorney status is only as good as they have access to your information. So if you're trusting someone to be your power of attorney, make sure that they have a copy of that power of attorney and then all of your banking and financial information. Unlike the delegation of parental authority, this doesn't expire after a year. Again, it's another pretty easy document. You can see the sample that's provided in the handout. So it doesn't necessarily expire, but it can be revoked at any time. You do have to revoke it in writing. So make sure you're designating somebody that you trust. If it doesn't work out and you do need to revoke it, you can do so, but you have to do so in writing.
Okay, so the legal part of a preparedness plan, I want to bring up briefly that order of protections can be very helpful for battered immigrant victims. They can do things like remove the abuser from the home, order no communication with the victim, order the abuser to pay child support, spousal maintenance, continuing health insurance, and also order the respondent to hand over important documents. But keep in mind, though, for some victims, staying in the home is not an option because they do share the home with like extended family. So a lot of times in this circumstance, us as advocates, we have discussions with them around alternative housing options, such as, maybe possibly going to a shelter. Are there any friends? Are there any other family that you have in 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 the community that you can stay with, or possibly assistance finding their own place. So order protections can be helpful in some ways, but also knowing that everybody's circumstance is going to be different, and really taking the time to sit down and talk it through with them.
And, especially when we're talking about immigrant survivors, orders for protection or, finding alternative housing can be difficult, depending on what they're eligible for. Protective orders can also be really helpful in the immigration context. The next bullet point is to screen for immigration relief. An order for protection can be used as evidence in an immigration case. In basically no case is it required. So again, talking over the pros and cons of getting an order for protection is important. But if you do have an order for protection and you apply for a U visa, a T visa, a VAWA, something like that, an order for protection could be used as evidence in those cases. As Ty was saying, you can also get documents from the respondent in an order for protection. So that could also be a really good way to get access to immigration documents that potentially the abuser has taken from you. That could be really helpful if you are ever detained by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. But it is really important, if you're an advocate who's working with a client who doesn't have immigration status, that you're referring them to a good immigration attorney in order to screen for relief. The person that you're working with may never have thought about applying for a benefit that they're eligible for. I know I've worked with folks who the clients that they're working with aren't even really sure what their status is. They know some papers have been filed for them. They think maybe their parent got citizenship, but they're not sure. And in this day and age, I think it's really important that people are well informed about their immigration status and well informed about their immigration options if they do have immigration options. It's also important, if they have an attorney, that they're carrying that information about their attorney with them at all times. If they are picked up and detained, that way they have the information they need to contact their attorney. If they don't have an attorney, it may be worthwhile to carry around the names and numbers of organizations who might be able to help them if they are detained. Detention facilities should be able to give you some of that information, but this whole presentation is a better safe than sorry presentation, and so I would recommend carrying around some of that information with you in case you are detained. Also be sure, as I said before, you know how to contact your consulate. They can be very helpful, both to you and your family, in connecting you to resources if you are picked up by police or by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And then important to talk about, and I've actually talked about this with folks, like, hey, if I was ever picked up, would you pay bail? Like, could I call you if I ever needed somebody to post bond or post bail for me? If you are concerned about being detained or concerned about being arrested, it's important to maybe figure out, who would I call if I need someone to post bond or post bail for me? And I would make sure that this person has valid immigration status. They're going to have to go into these detention facilities to post the bail. It's really important that they don't have any concerns around being picked up themselves. Ty, would you pay bail if I was picked up for me?
Yes.
Oof.
If I had money. I don't have anybody that would do this for me. Would you pay my bail? Because I've talked to people and they've said no.
I invoke my right to remain silent. We are being recorded.
Okay.
The last
then
slide.
I revoke my right to remain silent. I take back my answer.
Okay, well, y'all heard it here first. Okay, so the last slide is around resources for friends and family. I'm going to let you chat a little bit about the confidentiality part of it, Ty.
Sure. So the reason we put about do not forget about confidentiality is because just stemming back to my experience when we had that the immigration raid in our community, and lots of family and friends of people were coming into our agency and asking about, do you know so and so, or do you know what might have happened to to this person and telling me that this was their sister or this is their cousin or whatnot, right? That we always remember that confidential information, and that we are still going to we're going to work really hard to not violate confidentiality with the clients that we're serving. And so just giving resources for friends and family on how to locate their loved ones, and also encouraging them to talk to their attorney if they have one. But what we ended up doing is really not talking specifically around anyone that we're serving, because you can't you'd be violating your confidentiality practices if you were saying, oh yeah, I know so and so and whatever. So we be very intentional around that, and I wanted to flag that because I know in times of crisis and when people are coming to you and you see the concern in your eyes, and they're identifying that this is their daughter and whatever, like, you want to be super helpful, and as advocates we all want to be helpful, right? But to always remember, we have to remember about our confidentiality practices and the information that we're sharing, and not to violate that.
Oops, sorry, I am reminding people that if you want a copy of the PowerPoint, it is located in the Dropbox. Ty copy and pasted the link to the Dropbox at the top of the chat, but I just pasted it again for people who didn't see it up there. But you should be able to download the slides from that Dropbox. So as Ty was saying, don't forget about confidentiality. You can't, just because it is a time of crisis, you can't violate those protections. But while you may not be able to give specific information about maybe where this person's being detained or what's happening to this person in court, you can still refer people to generic resources. So one that I would highly recommend is something called an ICE detainee locator. So for folks who are more familiar with the VINE system in the criminal context, locating someone who's in jail for being picked up for a criminal violation, there's a similar database for people who are being held in ICE detention. And so I included the link there. If you type in ICE detainee locator into your search box, you should be able to find it that way too. The information that you need to know in order to use that is either you need their A number, which stands for alien registration number. Anybody who's ever filed any kind of immigration papers with USCIS, with immigration, should have an A number designated to them. If you're working with an immigrant client, recommend that they provide you with that A number, and make sure their friends and family know what their A number is. If you have their A number and country of birth, you can locate them on that ICE detainee locator. Or let's say you don't have the A number. You can also do so by using their first and last name, their country of birth, and their date of birth. And so with that information, you can tell whether or not the person is being detained at one of the 4 ICE detention facilities in Minnesota. And so for everybody's just information, general information, the 4 detention facilities in Minnesota are in Freeborn County, in Sherburne County, Carver County, and Polk County. You can also always provide them with a referral list for attorneys. So if they have a loved one, a family member who's in detention and they don't know what to do to help them, I think one of the most helpful things they can do is try and get them connected with a competent immigration attorney. We included in the Dropbox the Volunteer Lawyer Network attorney referral list, but I want to really specifically point out both the Immigrant Law Center, which is located in St. Paul but has a service area of the entire state of Minnesota. And then also the University of Minnesota Law School has something called the Center for New Americans, and they have a detainee rights clinic. And those 2 organizations and agencies work specifically with folks who are being detained. And so some of the referrals on that particular list are for attorneys outside of just people who are in detention, but both the Immigrant Law Center and the University of Minnesota have a specific program to work with people who are in detention. So I'd specifically point at those 2 things. And then always, always, always be encouraging friends and family to communicate with the immigration attorney. They may have more access. There's confidentiality rights there as well, but they may be able to get permission from the immigrant survivor to talk with friends and family about this stuff. They may be able to help in gathering documents and gathering money to post bail or bond. which they can gain that information from the immigration attorney. All right, and that brings us to the end of our presentation. So is there any last questions, Ty, that we haven't answered?
No. Looks
All
like
right.
no questions.
Well, I hope this was helpful for everybody. I know it's a lot to deal with. I know that these are stressful times when we're talking about immigration law. Believe me, I truly, truly do understand. Just know that you're not alone in this. Standpoint is here. I'm here. Ty's here. If you have additional questions or you have a particular case that you're working on and you just want to talk it over with somebody, we have our contact information, both the Standpoint office contact number there, but also Ty and my personal information. Please feel free to reach out to us. We're all in this together.
Yes, thank you so much. And those are our direct dials. So, you know, if you have a question or if you're working with someone and they have questions, and it's easier to call us so that we can talk it through with both of you at the same time, we're happy to do so. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.